Welcome to the keynote presentation of Tim Taylor. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Tim to everybody. We've known each other since, I think, the late 1990s, when we were both PhD students, more than 20 years ago. And since then, I've taken every opportunity personally that I can to work with Tim, and have invited him out to Australia on a number of occasions. And of course, been able to catch up with him at conferences like this one. He's a scientist, an author, and a programmer. He's usually based in Edinburgh, Scotland, when I can't get him out to Australia. He's a researcher and a software developer in artificial life and agent-based modeling and AI. And he's also got a deep interest in the history of these fields, and that's something of which we'll be discussing shortly. He's held research positions at leading institutions in the UK and Australia, including at Edinburgh, York, Goldsmiths, and at my own institution, Monash University in Australia. And his book, Rise of Self-Replicators, Early Visions of Machines, AI and Robots That Can Reproduce and Evolve, is co-authored with me. And it was published in 2020. He's currently working part-time and remotely as a senior research fellow in the Department of Data Science and AI at Monash, my department. And he's also progressing his own research career and writing interests as an independent researcher. He's an associate examiner too for the University of London, and he's an elected board member of the International Society for Artificial Life. So I'd like you all to work with me in thanking Tim for his presentation that he's about to give, and welcome, Tim. Off you go.
Thank you very much, Alan. Let me just share my screen. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, can you see my presentation? I will.
Yep, all good.
Okay, brilliant, nice. Okay, so thanks very much, Alan. I know it's 1 o'clock in the morning for you, so it really is above and beyond the call of duty for you to be staying up to introduce me. Much appreciated. And also thank you very much to Yitka and the other conference organizers for inviting me to talk today. So today I'm going to talk about the very early history of the idea of having a machine or AI or a robot that is able to reproduce and evolve just like biological organisms can do. As Alan mentioned, this talk is going to be based upon the book that we co-authored and was published last year by Springer called Rise of the Self-Replicators. That was published 2020. If you are at a university library that subscribes to Springer, you'll be able to find it on their website. But if not, there's a free author formatted PDF of the whole book available on my website. There's a link at the bottom. So I should start by saying what's so interesting about self-replicating machines. I've been working on this topic since the mid-1990s when I was doing my PhD on self-replicating computer programs. And it's always seemed to me that in contrast to a more traditional evolutionary algorithm you might use in AI or A-Life, where you've got a fixed goal and fitness function, which is pointing evolution in a certain direction. If the agents or robots are able to actually decide when and how they're going to reproduce by themselves, that gives the system a lot more open-endedness in its flavor and could potentially capture some of the creativity that we see in biological systems. And when you get into the details of thinking about the design of self-replicating machines, you naturally come across these deep questions about autonomy and agency. Working with self-replicating systems in software or in hardware or chemical systems can be used to experimentally address questions concerning definitions of life or the origin of life. And then, of course, there's massive economic implications for having a technology that can ramp up its production at an exponential rate, 1 turning into 2, then 4, then 8, particularly if we could direct these machines to produce something useful to us in addition to reproducing itself. One thing I've mentioned just out of interest, I recently came across this company, foundation.si. They are just closing their first round of seed funding. They say on their website, "We are building the first factory on the moon. Our vision is to develop infrastructure in space with self-replicating robots." I've been talking to one of the co-founders, Justin. It actually turns out that the two co-founders met when studying at the University of Edinburgh, just down the road from me. So in any case, there's certainly plenty of interest in this sort of thing now, as there was in the past. There are already a number of very good histories written of how this idea of self-replicating machines has developed. One of them is this very nice book, Kinematic Self-Replicating Machines, written by Robert Freitas and Ralph Merkel, published in 2004. There are other articles. So there's a review article here, a very nice one, 50 Years of Research on Self-Replication, published in the Artificial Life Journal by Moshe Sipper. And both of these have these nice diagrammatic lineages of how work on self-replication has progressed over the last 50 years or so. And you'll notice in both of these diagrams, they both begin with the work of John von Neumann in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So I wondered, where did von Neumann get his ideas from? Did they come out of the blue, or was there some preceding work upon which his ideas were based? So both of these reviews have some allusions to work prior to 1950, but really it's very uncharted territory in general. And so the main purpose of writing the book was to try and map out this very early history of the idea of self-replication in further detail. So why am I so interested? Why did I want to write a book about the early history of self-replicating machines? Well, as I'm about to demonstrate, it actually has a very long history of ideas. And that long history represents a rich resource for people thinking about self-replication and evolution today. So ideas and arguments, which we might think of as very new, have in fact a very long history. And in fact, something that was written, say, 150 years ago about self-replication is probably more relevant to read today with today's technology than it was when it was written. Much of what I'm going to talk about today is actually literary work rather than scientific or engineering studies. And there are some benefits to that. Literary authors are not constrained by the limitations of current day technology. And so they tend to be a lot more forward thinking and to think of a far ranger world of possibilities. It's very easy when you're working in science and engineering to get trapped into one way of thinking about things. And so for those reasons, I think it's very beneficial to look at the early history, not just of science and engineering, but also of literary contributions. Okay, so in our book, we trace this idea of a self-replicating machine, self-reproducing machine, back to the 1600s, really in the aftermath of René Descartes' arguments that animals could be viewed as natural automata. That is to say that you could completely understand the functioning of an animal through physical processes. That idea in itself had the sort of glimmerings of the notion of a self-replicating machine. So if animals were automata, animals can reproduce, and therefore at least some automata can reproduce. Of course, Descartes never actually put it in those terms, but we don't have to wait too long. And in the book, we talk about a number of people in the 200 years that followed Descartes that did specifically entertain the idea of a machine that can make a copy of itself. However, things really hotted up in the mid-1800s, and it's this area, sort of 1850s to 1950s, that I'm going to concentrate on in this talk. There are two main reasons why things really accelerated in this period. One was it came hot on the heels of the climax of the British Industrial Revolution. So in the early 1800s, people were accustomed to seeing more and more complicated machines in the factories in which they worked and all around them. And they were already becoming concerned about this pace of development and where that might ultimately take us. The British author Benjamin Disraeli, who was, of course, later to become Prime Minister of Great Britain, wrote a novel in 1844 called Coningsby. In that, there's a passage where the narrator is describing the industrial landscape of Manchester at the time. And looking at these machines and how complex they're getting, the narrator says, and why would one say that the machine does not live? It breathes, it moves, and has it not a voice? And yet the mystery of mysteries is to view machines making machines, a spectacle that fills the mind with curious and even awful speculation. So even in the 1840s, there was this concern about the complexification of machines and the fact that they were being employed to make more machines and where that might ultimately take us. The second factor that really contributed to the flourishing of ideas in the mid-1800s was, of course, the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859. A year after that, Asa Gray, the American botanist and friend of Charles Darwin, published a series of articles in the Atlantic magazine to popularize Darwin's ideas. This is, I believe, the first example of a published argument where there's an analogy drawn between biological evolution and the evolution of human technology. So Gray says, man alters from time to time his instruments or machines as new circumstances or conditions may require and his wit suggest. Minor alterations and improvements he adds to the machine he possesses. He adapts a new rig or a new rudder to an old boat. This answers to variation. In course of time, the old ones could be worn out or wrecked. The best sorts would be chosen for each particular use and further improved upon. And so the primordial boat be developed into the scow, the skiff, the sloop, and other species of watercraft. This is natural selection. Of course, in this passage, Gray wasn't specifically talking about self-reproducing machines as such, but we don't have to wait very long to find people who are talking about exactly that, machines that can both self-reproduce and evolve. So this is a map of the main content, what I want to talk about today, and I'm going to divide this into 4 categories. The first one is early literary work from the 1860s to the 1920s. Then I want to say a bit about the development of early sci-fi stories, particularly pulp sci-fi from the 1920s onwards. Then I'm going to say a bit about scientists who speculated from a scientific perspective about self-replication and evolution of machines. And then finally, we get to the stage where there's a development of theory and implementation of self-reproducing machines from a scientific and engineering perspective. So let's look at the first of these, early literary work from the 1860s onwards. The first person to mention is Samuel Butler. So he was an English author who as a young man emigrated to New Zealand in 1859. He wanted to develop some independence from his family, earn some of his own wealth by setting up a sheep ranch, which was a popular thing to do in those days. There was some family connection from a while back between the Butlers and the Darwins. And Butler read On the Origin of Species soon after he arrived in New Zealand. And this was to form a inspiration for many of Butler's later writings. So including among those, Darwin Among the Machines, which was a letter that I'm about to talk about in more detail. There were other letters too to newspapers and magazines. And then the most famous of his works was his novel Erewhon, which was published in 1872. So this is the front cover of the Press magazine, the Press newspaper, which is a local newspaper from Christchurch, New Zealand. And we can see the date here, Saturday, June the 13th, 1863. And at the bottom of the second column here is the start of Butler's letter, Darwin Among the Machines. So in this letter, Butler noted that it is true that machinery is even at this present time employed in begetting machinery and becoming the parent of machines. So this is echoing the observation that Disraeli had in Coningsby 20 years earlier. But Butler went on to say, the reproductive organs of the machines might become developed in a manner which we are hardly yet able to conceive. So he saw this extrapolating into the future. Machines are becoming less and less reliant on humans for their reproduction, and they might get to a stage where they're completely self-reproducing. He spent the rest of his career trying to work through the consequences of this for humanity and the future of our species. His ideas varied a bit over the various publications that he produced, but it's fair to say in most of them, it didn't end very well for the humans. Around the same time, we also see George Eliot, the pen name of the British author Mary Ann Evans, who in 1879 published the last of her works, The Impressions of Theophrastus Such. This is a series of conversations exploring different aspects of human nature. And in the second last chapter, which is called Shadows of the Coming Race, it's a conversation between two characters, one of whom is quite enthusiastic about machines and technology, and the other one is more cautious. And so there's the cautious character in this chapter thinks that machines, because they're unencumbered by such petty things, as they say, as human consciousness or emotion, that they will be more efficient and will eventually outcompete humans and become the dominant intelligent species on the planet. And there's this lovely verse at the end of this chapter where this character says, and thus this planet may be filled with beings who will be blind and deaf as the inmost rock, yet will execute changes as delicate and complicated as those of human language and all the intricate web of what we call its effects, without sensitive impression and without sensitive impulse. There may be, let us say, mute orations, mute rhapsodies, mute discussions, and no consciousness there even to enjoy the silence. So it's a very dystopian world that is being painted in George Eliot's chapter here. There are a lot of issues that Eliot raises, which are exactly the same as Butler raised in his work. There was also Alfred Marshall, who I won't go into details, but he was also writing at the same time. And so you wonder where all these ideas come from. Are they connected? I try to draw out the connections between all of the people thinking about these ideas at the time. As you can see, it's a very tangled web of personal and professional connections. And indeed, Eliot at the end of her chapter says, these ideas seem to be flying around in the air with other germs. And it's a common theme about what I'm going to talk about in the rest of this talk, and in science in general, that there seem to be moments in time where the components of a new idea are all in place, and a number of different people start to put those components together in the same way at the same time, but quite independently of each other. Okay, one final person I want to talk about in this early literary work is our friend Karel Čapek. So in RUR in 1920, the robots are, you could say, collectively and collaboratively building their own offspring. They're working in a factory to build more of themselves. So this is interesting because it brings up the idea of different kinds of architectures for self-reproduction. So it doesn't have to be a monolithic single machine that's building a copy of itself, but it could be more like a factory or a society of machines each doing a specialized task, but between them all, they are producing all the parts. They have production closure, as you might say, of everything required to build more copies of themselves. At the end of RUR, you could view it as a struggle for the ownership of the robot's DNA, as it were. So the only things the robots can't do is they don't have access to this secret chemical formula that is the magic substance from which they are made. That formula is, or at least was, safely hidden away in Rossum's safe. And so this is another example of how it's interesting to look back at these early stories and to see that the authors are considering ideas and architectures for self-replication evolution that might be somewhat different to what we're accustomed to thinking. Okay, moving on to the second aspect of the talk, the development of early sci-fi stories, and particularly pulp sci-fi stories, which were born in America in the 1920s. So pulp sci-fi is mass-produced sci-fi short stories that are published on a regular basis. And these kicked off in the 1920s. And from that moment onwards, there are loads and loads of these stories that involve self-reproducing and evolving machines of some form or other. And these are just a few of my favorite ones from the first 20, 30 years of this period. There are many more. The first story that I'm aware of that discusses machine reproduction and evolution is a short story called Automata by the British author S. Fowler Wright. This is published in the magazine Weird Tales in 1929. There are a number of elements of this story which I think is worth going through because these are common to many of these stories and also to many of the previous literary work that I've already mentioned. So it starts off with the recognition that humans are becoming servants to machines, and human activity is more and more taken up with repairing and tending to machines and building more machines. And so this idea is then extrapolated to the future, where machines rely less and less upon humans for their operation and reproduction, and eventually develop the autonomy to completely self-reproduce without any human intervention. There's also a notion in this work of the machines designing their own offspring. Now, this is another interesting idea, which I don't think has really been taken up in modern developments in AI and A-life research in practice. It's an idea that's talked about a lot in the current AGI literature, but I don't think there's been much concrete development of this idea in current work. And then inevitably, this eventually leads to the extinction of the human race as we're supplanted in our position as the dominant intelligent species by these machines. And that raises a question, is that the inevitable next stage of evolution? And a lot of these stories ask that question. And some have a positive view of that and some negative. So, okay, so the human race is going to be driven to extinction by machines. That doesn't sound so good. On the other hand, some see it as a source of pride that rather than being supplanted by the next intelligent biological species, we are actually designing our own successors. And in some sense, the flame of humanity is passed on for many millennia to come in the form of machines, even if we're not around in the form that we know it. And so you can ask a question, and many of these stories do, is this a fate that we're destined to? Can we avoid it? And the common answer in these stories is to avoid this fate, we must destroy all machines and go back to a simpler way of life. In fact, Butler in Darwin Among the Machines in 1863 also raised exactly this point. But Butler said in 1863, well, yes, we could do that in theory, but let's be honest, human society is already far too entangled with machines and reliant on machines for its functioning. There is no way that we could do that in practice. And if that's true, if that was true in 1863, then it's true a millionfold today. Okay, and there's this lovely passage at the end of Automata. Even in the early days of the 20th century, man had stood in silent adoration around the machines that had self-produced a newspaper or a needle. And at that time, they could no more have conceived what was to follow than the first ape that drew the sheltering branches together could foresee the dim magnificence of a cathedral dome. So there's this sense here that humans are playing with a technology that they really have no understanding of what the long-term consequences of that technology will be. There's one final author that I would like to mention in this sci-fi section, and that is Anatoly Dneprov, the Russian science fiction writer and popularizer of science, among other things. He wrote this story in 1958 called Crabs on the Island. As far as I'm aware, it's the first discussion of self-replicating evolving machines in the Russian literature. So his story involved two men, an inventor and his colleague, who are traveling to a remote island. And the inventor has all these boxes that he's unpacking. One of them contains what looks like a toy crab. It actually turns out to be not a toy at all. The inventor explains it's a self-reproducing crab. And in all these other boxes he's unpacking, there's a whole load of junk metal that he's brought for food, for this crab to consume and produce copies of itself. And he says he's doing this to test Darwin's theories. And sure enough, before too long, these things start reproducing, produce more and more of themselves, and they soon become engaged in an evolutionary arms race and become bigger and more fierce and cruel in their interactions and battles with each other as they're competing for resources. This doesn't end well for the inventor. One of these like advanced, vicious machines notices that he's got a crown in his tooth and thinks, oh, that would be a nice bit of metal I could use to reproduce myself. So that doesn't end well. Dneprov is an interesting character. He was very much interested in ideas of AI and artificial life in the 50s and 60s. He also wrote another story in 1961 called The Game, where he was exploring questions about whether machines could think and really understand things. And the story involved humans who were acting, following rote instructions in a collection of humans following rote instructions to translate a text from Portuguese to Russian. Now, anyone familiar with AI will think that sounds like a very familiar story. In fact, it's almost exactly the same as John Searle's Chinese room argument, which was put forward 20 years after Dneprov had written this to address the same ideas. So it's another example of these different people coming up with the same ideas around the same time. But Dneprov is certainly a very interesting character when thinking about the early evolution or early development of these ideas in Russia. Okay, so moving on to the third aspect of this story, that's the development of speculation thought about self-replicating machines and evolving machines from scientists. The first person to talk about this at length was the British X-ray crystallographer, J.D. Bernal. He was a very eminent scientist. In fact, two of his PhD students went on to win Nobel Prizes, Dorothy Hodgkin and Max Perutz. Bernal was also very interested in questions of how science can improve society and the relationship between the two. And he wrote on a wide variety of topics over his lifetime. One of the first of these sort of wider explorations that he published was a short book in 1929 called The World, the Flesh and the Devil. In this, he tried to set out what could be said about the very distant future of humanity from a scientifically defensible point of view, so avoiding all the obvious pitfalls you might come across in such an endeavor. Arthur C. Clarke later described this as the most brilliant attempt at scientific prediction ever made. So in this book, Bernal reasoned that it's inevitable some point in the future, we're going to run out of resources for mankind here on Earth. And therefore, we will be forced to move into space and to start thinking about colonizing other planets if we want humankind to continue to expand. So he thought about how that might be achieved, and he came up with this concept of generating basically an artificial planet, so a spaceship. He conceived it as a globe which would be about 10 miles in diameter and house maybe 10,000 human colonists. And this globe would be completely self-sustaining. It would get energy from the sun, maybe collect raw materials from asteroids, and everything inside would be recycled. And it would essentially be a miniature Earth on which humans could live. But he said a globe which was merely a satisfactory way of continuing life indefinitely would barely be more than a reproduction of terrestrial conditions in a more restricted sphere. And so the essential positive activity of the globe or colony would be in the development, growth, and reproduction of the globe. And so we see here the introduction of this idea of self-replication technology as a means by which humans might travel into space and eventually colonize other planets. So he saw there would inevitably be competition between these globes as they reproduced, and that would eventually drive some of them to move to different star systems and look for resources elsewhere. And over the generations of travel between stars sustained on the globe, we would eventually reach and colonize other worlds. Okay. There's one more scientist that I would like to talk about in this section, and that is Andrei Kolmogorov, the Russian mathematician and polymath. Many people in the Artificial Life Conference will be familiar with Kolmogorov for his work on definitions of complexity and information theory. But Kolmogorov was also very interested in questions concerning artificial intelligence and artificial life. And in 1961, he gave a lecture at Moscow State University called Automata in Life. This seminar was so popular, they actually had to move it to a larger room. And in the following year, he gave 2 further lectures expanding upon these themes. They were called Life and Thinking as Special Forms of the Existence of Matter and Cybernetics in the Study of Life and Thinking. So Kolmogorov noted that with the onset of the space travel and also the development of computers in the early 1960s, these both brought a more pressing need to understand both living organization and also thought and intelligence from more general principles, so not just the parochial based upon the particular biology that we find on planet Earth. So at the start of his lecture, Automata and Life, he asked some questions. This is an English translation by the US government, who like to translate all of these things. So Kolmogorov asks, can machines reproduce their kind? And in the course of such self-reproduction, can progressive evolution take place, leading to the creation of machines of a higher degree of perfection than the originals? Can machines experience emotions? And can machines have desires? And can they pose for themselves new problems not put to them by their constructors? So these were public lectures, and Kolmogorov wasn't going to go into technical responses to these questions at the time. But he did say that although these seem very far-fetched ideas, there's no fundamental arguments against positive answers to these questions. if you take a materialist worldview. He did caution, however, that if we're going to build artificial living beings that are truly deserving of that title, then we need to understand not just their functional aspects, their inputs and outputs, but also their internal desires. This links into a wider narrative about the adoption of cybernetics and artificial intelligence ideas in Soviet Russia in the 1950s and 1960s, and links to Marxist ideas about the centrality of the creative act of human beings, and also the idea of thought as a collective social process. There's a very interesting history that could be written about how Marxist views and early political ideas in Soviet Russia influenced and directed the development of AI and cybernetics in the USSR. I'm certainly not qualified to write such a review, but I very much look forward to reading one when someone does. Okay, so now we get to the fourth and final aspect of this story, which is the emergence of theory and implementation of self-replicating machines by scientists and engineers from the late 1940s onwards. And as I showed in those lineages at the beginning of the talk, the monumental figure at the start of all of this was the Hungarian-American polymath John von Neumann, who put the subject on a firm theoretical grounding in the late 1940s. So he showed that it was logically possible to create a machine which, when given some instructions, would read those instructions and use them to build a copy of itself. There was no problem with like an infinite regress, where the information would have to contain information about the offspring and the offspring's offspring and all of that. Von Neumann solved that problem. And not only that, he also showed that it was possible for such a machine to build something more complicated than itself, which is quite contrary to common experience of machines, which usually are producing something less complex than themselves. Von Neumann's idea was based upon Turing's idea of the universal computer, and von Neumann adapted that so that he had a machine that was operating on parts which are the same kinds of elements from which it itself was constructed. So this machine could take a description of an arbitrary other machine and then build that machine. And so if you feed it a description of the universal constructor itself, it builds a copy of itself. And in von Neumann's work, we see the introduction of this new idea of what I call a maker replicator. So a self-replicating machine that can not only build copies of itself, but it can also build a copy of any arbitrary other machine we want. And so we might use this as a way of using this technology to generate outputs that are of some use to us. These ideas were further taken up by Edward Moore, who wrote an article in Scientific American in 1956 called Artificial Living Plants, where he discussed what it might take to take von Neumann style maker replicators and have them operate in the real world, so that they were taking power from sunlight and using resources in their local environment to reproduce themselves, and also in such a way that they were producing materials or energy that were useful to humans and that we could harvest. In this article, he talks a little bit about the dangers of such an endeavor and the environmental havoc that this sort of thing could turn up. But it's fair to say there's a lot more that could and should be said about the potential hazards than was written in Moore's article. Okay, and then we finally get to the first implementations of self-reproducing machines in software and in hardware in the mid-1950s. But it should be said that these both took a very much simpler approach to self-replication than von Neumann's Universal Constructor architecture. So both of these works by Baricelli and Penrose used a simple linear self-replicator, which was more akin to a strand of DNA that was reproducing by template replication. So Baricelli, who was working in von Neumann's group in Princeton in 1953, developed what's essentially a one-dimensional cellular automata, where there were patterns in his system which would reproduce from one time step to the next and would also evolve. And Baricelli spent the next 20 years or so studying evolution in this kind of system. On the hardware side, Lionel Penrose, who is a British psychiatrist, also had interest in many other ideas, including the origin of life, built some really ingenious wooden models of replication. Penrose was really keen to build models. He did this for a lot of his ideas. He found it was very instructive to build physical models he could play around with to test out his intuitions. There's some nice videos of his wooden models on my website, and I'm going to show you a little clip of one of those now, just to give you some flavor for his work.
Limitations in size and the amount of information that can be carried are avoided by these molecules. They again can't link unless activated. They can be built into self-replicating chains of any given length. A seed of 2 connected units replicates itself, and a chain of 3 builds another chain of 3 in a similar way. Orderly growth is ensured by the shapes of the levers. Red and blue units, like always pairs with like, so that the new chain formed is exactly like the old one. Not until the final unit is in place on the new chain can the last cross-link holding old and new together be released. Limitations in size.
Okay, so some really ingenious models there, and he went on to use what he'd discovered in that, what he'd learned about self-replication to write further papers on the origin of life. The final person that I want to talk about in this talk today is Konrad Zuse. And he's really a figure that is virtually unheard of, as far as I'm aware, in the artificial life community and AI in general, probably. He was an early computer pioneer. If you read his biography, he has a claim that he was the first person to produce a working digital computer. And these claims always have asterisks, and they're it depends exactly how you define a digital computer, and there are a number of people who are competing for that claim. But Zuse was definitely one of the key early pioneers of digital computers. Slightly later in his life, in 1957, he was awarded an honorary degree from the Technical University of Berlin. And when on that occasion, he gave a seminar, which later was published as a paper, called Thoughts on Automation and the Problem of the Technical Germ Cell. So what was his technical germ cell? Well, Zuse, in self-replication, as in all of his work, he was very interested in the practicalities of building machines. So much less than von Neumann, who was interested in, you could say, the information flow of self-replication, Zuse was interested in the practicalities of actually building a machine like this, and also the long-term applications. And one application he was particularly interested in is if you had imagine a manufacturing plant of some sort, creating something useful for us. And the question is, could you have a self-replicating machine and make a replicator like von Neumann's idea that after a few rounds of reproduction would produce a manufacturing plant of a given specification? And if you could do that, what's the minimal form of organization and functionality you would require in this initial germ cell, as he called it? And then going one further than that, also thinking about spatial dimensions. what's the smallest possible germ cell you could have that could, after a number of series of reproductions, could generate a specific manufacturing plant. He had this notion of a series of reproducing germ cells, which each one would produce a copy of itself at a slightly smaller scale. So after a number of iterations, you would get a miniaturization of the germ cell to get what he called the real germ cell, the really smallest germ cell you could possibly imagine. I mean, he recognized the practicalities and the problems of this. You would need different physical processes involved in manufacture at different scales, but he argued that this at least was something worthy of consideration. In his later work, he also introduced the idea of the Raman, the German framework. This is the notion that a self-replicating machine is never truly self-replicating, but always requires some input from the environment in which it operates. And a lot of other people I've talked about recognize that too. It's useful to have a word, and it's useful to think about that when thinking about self-reproducing machines. And then in the 60s and 70s, he started work on designing at least one part of a self-reproducing machine. And his approach was to use a small set of modular parts to make it an easier process. Just quickly, this idea of a technical germ cell was very similar to an idea that appeared in a story by Philip K. Dick a couple of years earlier, 1955. The story Autofac ended with a vision of self-replicating machines making little seeds that it was shooting out into space, which would then land on other planets and build new self-replicating machines on those planets. So again, I wondered, what's the connection here? Did Zeus read Philip K. Dick's work 2 years before? But then I found these notes in the Zeus archive. These are stenographic notes, so German shorthand that Zeus wrote during the war in 1941. On the Zeus archive, they're translated to German, and then I translated to English and found that he was essentially talking about this technical germ cell idea in 1941, so way before Philip K. Dick, and even before anything published by von Neumann. So Conrad Zeus, again, someone who deserves a lot more attention from the artificial life community. Okay, so that's the end of really what we focus on in the book. And as I said at the beginning, there are plenty of good histories of the development of the field since then, since the 50s and 60s. Just to mention a very few highlights. In 1980, NASA did a study of using self-replication as a means for space missions, developing planetary settlements on other planets. There's been a lot of work in safety issues, and one of the first of those with the Foresight Institute guidelines for the responsible development of nanotechnology, which includes a lot about what should and shouldn't be done with self-replicating work. And there's a lot of continuing work in both in software replicators and also hardware replicators. A lot of the hardware stuff is still aimed at using it as a technology to use in space for mining, or potentially even for future human colonization. A lot of it is to do with these ideas of production closure, using 3D printing and other new technologies. But there is ongoing work in this area. So I'm running out of time. Some final reflections. It's useful to think about categorizing this work. There's certainly different goals and types of issues raised. Sociological, so many of these early works concentrated on the implications of this kind of technology for society. Scientific experiments, studying living organization and the origin of life, and commercial applications too. There are different analogies, as I've said. Von Neumann took a machine analogy, his maker replicators, whereas other people have taken more of an origin of life analogy. So there's a question of whether you could have some sort of intermediate between that, but really the appropriate analogy to take very much depends upon your goals. Various assumptions and contexts, as I've said earlier. these shape the way that research develops, and it's easy to take biological analogies too literally and exclude other possibilities. So this idea of collective reproduction, Lamarckian evolution and direct transfer of learned knowledge, its possibilities, and self-designing machines and recursive self-improvement. There are challenges involved in all of this: production closure, as I've mentioned, material closure, so machines being able to get all of the food that they require from their environment to reproduce, recycling of waste, balance of work, this Zeus's idea of the Raman, and mutations in the control of evolution, and how we can ensure that if we allow machines to evolve, that they will evolve in a way that is beneficial to us and not detrimental to us. Okay, so last slide. I mentioned the foresight guidelines. There's been a lot of other developments recently in AI safety. The Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, the Future of Life Institute that's developed the Asimiloma AI principles, Future of Humanity Institute, and others. There are a lot more, but this is certainly a growing area of concern and interest. And so finally, I just want to end with a quote from the final pages of our book to say, whether this technology is ultimately beneficial or detrimental to us depends upon how well we understand the issues at stake and upon how that understanding enables us to properly manage its development. A thorough understanding of these issues should be based upon a sound appreciation of the history of the ideas involved. And it's my hope that in our book and in this talk, we've made some little contribution to that goal of providing a sound appreciation for the history of the ideas involved. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's very quiet. You can't hear anybody clapping. I think we have to work on Zoom to allow people to hear in the webinar. Okay, so thanks again. And there's a number of questions that are popping into the Q&A. I'll just have a quick flick over to them. So the first one was actually from Susan Stepney, who was asking, when Disraeli said awful, in double quotes, did he mean the modern meaning horrible or the original meaning full of awe? And I did, whilst you were speaking, quickly look up the etymology of the word. So the weakened sense very bad is apparently from 1809. So it's just possible.
Okay, I mean, I was assuming he was using it in terms of inspiring awe, but rather than the more modern sense. But I must admit, I hadn't looked into the etymology, so maybe he was using it in the modern sense. I don't know is the answer to that.
We'll have to go and hunt. Then Carlos Gershenson says, it seems to me that most speculations in science fiction scenarios have not come to happen. I know it's difficult to generalize, but perhaps there's something, in double quotes, that many people thought it was a given with machines. So two questions follow. Can we characterize this something beyond Brooks' juice? And two, will we ever be able to build self-replicating machines with this something, or is there something that limits us inherently? Okay,
so I think one thing that comes out of this, so von Neumann's work shows from a theoretical point of view that it's possible to build machines that can reproduce and build something more complex. But von Neumann didn't address any of the practical issues that Zeus, for example, was interested in, but he didn't come to any final resolutions either. And so, yeah, the question of energy is something that is very much missing from these early considerations of self-replication. These are issues that are like the central issues in current work on self-reproduction. So what is the energy source, and what are the materials from which the machine is built? So there's a growing, I guess, confidence as we learn more about the composition of materials available on the moon and on Mars, that it might be possible to collect all of the elements that we need to actually do this in practice. And then again, Zeus's idea of trying to design things in the simplest possible way with a small number of modular components will certainly help. But so I'd say there doesn't seem to be anything theoretically preventing this from being achieved, but it's just a very, very difficult engineering challenge. And I guess the fact that people are still working on it after all this time says at least that people haven't given up hope, and it is still considered to be an achievable goal.
Okay, the next question is from Charles Afria. He says, this history was fascinating. Most of it seems to be centered on Europe and the US. Has there been much exploration of self-replicating machines in other parts of the world? It wasn't clear if these ideas are inherently linked to Western thought versus whether that was your focus, or there simply weren't many other historical resources on these topics accessible in English.
Well, I think to some extent, it is clearly a development as we trace it back to Descartes and the Cartesian distinction and view of animals as machines. Yeah, it's very much a Western kind of idea, I would say, to think of a machine that can reproduce and to, I guess, have the hubris that human beings could produce machines that are reproduced like biological organisms. But at the same time, I can't rule out the possibility that there is relevant stuff in other languages that we just haven't found. We did look in texts in Russian and German and Spanish and others, and it's a little easier to do this kind of research these days with Google Translate if you use it correctly. But yeah, I certainly can't rule out the possibility that there are interesting contributions from other parts of the world that I've simply not discovered.
I think we've got 1 minute for one more question. So Lance Williams asks for your thoughts. He says, regarding Butler's fear that we will be replaced, I don't think that the will to live has a rational basis. In Ian McEwan's Machines Like Me, the intelligent machines that Turing, in a counterfactual history, builds keep turning themselves off. It's possible that intelligence is significantly greater than our own might see existence as pointless. What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, that's a nice question to try and answer in 1 minute.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, what I will say is that this sort of thing was addressed in many of the early stories that I talked about. So there was one, I can't remember offhand which one, but it was one of these pulp sci-fi stories. There was a machine that had been developed to look after all of humans' needs, and but the machine ultimately saw that the humans were becoming, they were deteriorating their physical condition, they were becoming stupid, they weren't having to think for themselves. So the machine actually decided to up sticks and migrate to a different planet, and it was going to leave the humans to learn how to fend for themselves again. And yeah, I mean, maybe maybe there's something in that, but I don't know if there's much more I can say, but it is certainly an idea that has been explored in various of these early sci-fi stories that I talked about.
So the questions are still popping in, but what I'll do is I'll collect the whole list, everyone that's added to the Q&A, and I'll paste it into an email and send it to Tim, and then he can address it on Slack or in any way that he likes.
Brilliant.
Okay, so please join me as loudly as you can. I see people typing in the comments, knocking on tables and clapping. Please thank Tim once again for his great presentation, and I'll at least clap. Thanks, Tim.